In August 2025, the Sahel sun scorched the land. Across cracked clay, a young boy dragged an empty jerrycan, a haunting picture of daily life in a nation built on thirst. In the middle of this crisis, President Ibrahim Traoré took a decision that shocked the world. He ordered millions of gallons of fresh water to be buried beneath the desert sands. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To his people, it raised urgent questions. Who controls the valves? Can a starving nation afford to hide its lifeline? And what happens when the thirsty discover salvation is buried just beneath their feet? This was the beginning of a new doctrine, the Sovereign Water Doctrine. When Traoré signed Directive 44B, the words sounded cold and technical. Strategic reserves of desalinated water shall be stored underground under sovereign protection. But behind those lines was a radical idea. That water was not charity, not aid, not even a shared blessing from the heavens. Water was a resource to be guarded as tightly as uranium, as gold, as oil. For Traoré, this was not policy. It was survival. Burkina Faso has no ocean, no great river, and barely 600 millimeters of rain in an entire year. Every well becomes a battlefield. Every drought, a national emergency. Villages clash over trickles of groundwater. Corporations drill where farmers once sowed. Soldiers patrol rivers as if they were front lines. Here, water is not seasonal. It is political. So when Traoré declared that millions of gallons of desalinated water would be hidden under the sands, many wondered if the young president had gone too far. To hide water in a nation of thirst sounded less like vision and more like cruelty. But Traoré's engineers explained otherwise. Ordinary reservoirs lose billions of liters to heat and evaporation. In the Sahel, where the sun climbs relentlessly, dams turn into sieves. And in times of conflict, reservoirs become easy targets, poisoned, sabotaged, or stolen. So the plan was radical: bury the water. Seal it beneath engineered dunes, wrapped in hydrophobic and triple geomembrane layers. Hidden from the sun. Protected from theft. Guarded against war. This was no pond. It was a vault, not just to quench today's thirst, but to secure tomorrow's survival. The technology was both simple and cutting edge. Seawater was pumped inland through vast pipelines, purified in solar-powered reverse osmosis plants, and then injected into underground chambers designed to last generations. Synthetic barriers prevented leaks and contamination. Artificial intelligence, built in Ouagadougou by Burkinabe programmers under 30, monitored every drop. It could detect leaks smaller than a pinhole, dispatch drones to scan desert surfaces, and ensure no sabotage went unseen. What satellites missed, local engineers tracked with precision. But this was never only about water, it was about sovereignty. A rejection of IMF blueprints, foreign contractors, and donor dependence. This was Burkinabe youth, with laptops, pumps, and sand writing their own survival manual. Still, the outside world mocked in Brussels, they called it reckless in Geneva, wasteful. Economists asked, why bury salvation when children walk miles each day for a muddy sip? Traoré's response was blunt: short-term relief is a trap. Aid trucks bring bottles, but never freedom. Donor-funded wells collapse when contracts expire. The West gives us buckets while our house burns. We are building a fireproof reservoir. For him, the real enemy was not bullets or bombs. It was dust. It was heat. A slow, silent genocide of climate neglect. Against that quiet death, his answer was preparation. Across the Sahel, hundreds of young engineers, trained not in Paris or Washington, but in Accra and Addis Ababa, carried the mission. They mapped dry valleys, welded pipes, coded systems. Children of drought and displacement, turning survival into innovation. Farmers saw sons and daughters return from cities not to escape, but to build. Mothers who had buried harvest after harvest whispered of hope. Every pump lowered into the desert was not just infrastructure. It was pride, poured into the ground. Yet doubts remained. Could a country importing grain afford to bury water instead of distributing it? Could hidden reserves remain hidden when villages discovered salvation beneath their feet? In marketplaces, arguments raged. Some called it hoarding. Others defended it as strategy, reminding skeptics that desert survival has always meant storing what is scarce. Traoré's own words silenced the debate. If we drink everything today, tomorrow we will bury our children, not water. Applause followed. Unease followed too. But one truth stood clear. Water, more than oil, more than gold, is becoming the currency of the century. By mid-century, wars will erupt not for land, but for rivers. Crops will fail not for lack of soil, but for lack of rain. Nations that bury money will lose it, nations that bury water may one day rise. For the Burkinabe people, this doctrine transformed water from a fleeting gift into a sovereign weapon, a shield for survival. Despite ridicule abroad, many inside Burkina Faso embraced the paradox. Yes, they still queued at taps that coughed dust. Yes, children still trekked miles for muddy sips. But for the first time, they saw hope. That their children might inherit more than cracked soil and broken pumps. The buried reservoirs were invisible, yet their promise was visible everywhere, in the determination of young engineers, in the quiet resolve of farmers, in the vision of a president who dared to treat water not as aid, but as destiny. Would you hide water to save your children's future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. But that's only half the story. By 2025, the climate data was merciless. Canaso recorded less than 740 millimeters of rain, its lowest in a decade. Provinces like Yudelin and Tapoa barely touched 500 millimeters, far below survival levels for crops or cattle. The Sahel's thin green belt was turning gray, then brown, then dust. This was no longer an anomaly. It was the new normal. Year after year, rains came late, or not at all. First the millet vanished. Then the goats. Then families themselves. Between 2018 and 2024, more than 1.6 million Burkinabe were displaced. Some fled terror groups. But most fled thirst. On the dry riverbeds of the north, cattle collapsed where water once pooled. In the south, mothers scraped rust-colored rainwater from corrugated roofs into blackened pots, praying it would not make their children sick. In Kaya and Faitanaga, entire classrooms emptied to children spending their days walking 20 kilometers just for a sip of mud. Even the capital was not spared. Ouagadougou's water plants, dependent on shrinking runoff, operated at 30% below demand. The city had doubled in population in just 15 years. Its pipes had not. The result was rationing, black markets, and simmering unrest. International observers called it a crisis. Farmers simply called it breakfast. No water means no food. No food means no future, an elder told a local journalist. Entire communities vanished from maps. Sorghum fields turned brittle and gray. Families abandoned ancestral homes, not because of warlords, but because wells went silent. This was the slow violence of climate collapse, a war without bullets, but with casualties just as real. And when the government buried water beneath the sand, the world mocked. Headlines called it madness. Paris economists wrote white papers dismissing it as impractical. Geneva consultants scoffed, "What they hide will evaporate anyway." They saw only the thirst of today, not the survival of tomorrow. In Washington, think tanks debated, was Traoré leading his people into paranoia or prophecy? At home, pressure mounted in silence until the president himself spoke. He called water not a resource, but an inheritance. In August 2025, he unveiled Directive AGX 1025. Its message was stark: water would be treated as a strategic national asset protected by law alongside gold and uranium. Unauthorized drilling into deep aquifers would be punished like illegal mining, with equipment seized, prosecutions filed, and reparations demanded. Traoré declared openly water is not just for drinking. Water is the foundation of independence. In August 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré delivered the words that echoed across the desert. "If we don't act today, our children will die of thirst tomorrow." For some, it was terrifying. For others, it was galvanizing, a rare moment when a leader named the crisis without denial. Across villages, the phrase spread like wildfire. Farmers repeated it. Students painted it on walls. It became both a warning and a promise. Burkina Faso was still thirsty. Wells were still dry. But something had shifted. For the first time in decades, the nation wasn't waiting for aid convoys or foreign contractors. It was writing its own survival doctrine. Critics warned of hoarding and political control. Donors threatened to cut aid. Western headlines mocked the policy as burying hope. But Traoré stood firm. "The West would rather see us beg than build. We will beg no more." This wasn't just about water. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and survival. Elders who once walked barefoot for water now saw their grandchildren coding AI to guard hidden reservoirs. The paradox remained: people still thirsted while water lay buried. Yet in places like Kédougou and Yatina, signs of change appeared. Green fields returned. Women's cooperatives planted tomatoes. Wells lasted longer. Between 2023 and 2025, 318 microdams captured floods, stored rain, and recharged aquifers. They weren't grand megaprojects. They were modest, practical lifelines, hinges between despair and possibility. Burkina Faso still walks a knife's edge. But for the first time, its people believed tomorrow might hold more than dust. Cattle herders who once walked 30 kilometers for a trough could now water their animals within their own provinces. Small solar pumps fed irrigation grids, making dry-season farming possible for the first time in years. For rural women, the change was transformative. Freed from daily treks in search of water, they formed cooperatives, grew vegetables, sold produce, and reinvested in their villages. In some areas, harvests doubled within a single cycle, turning scarcity into opportunity. The effects rippled quickly. School attendance rose as children no longer spent days fetching water. Local markets bustled with fresh produce in months once marked by hunger. Farmers who had abandoned their land returned to plant again. For villages once dependent on sacks of imported grain, growing food once more was not just survival, it was dignity restored. Microdams became the visible proof of Traoré's doctrine. Each carried more than water, they carried politics. In a nation long tied to aid, every basin built without a foreign logo declared, "This water stays here." No IMF oversight, no donor logos, no fleets of white SUVs. Just local youth building with their own hands, funded by national revenues, guided by indigenous knowledge. But sovereignty carried new tensions. Who controlled the valves? Who decided who drank first? Chiefs, mayors, and cooperatives clashed over access. Critics warned that the government's hidden reserves could be used as political leverage. By elevating water to the level of gold and uranium, Traoré had secured it from outsiders but concentrated its power in the state. Still, the benefits were undeniable. Floods that once destroyed homes were tamed. Aquifers began to recover. Goats no longer collapsed on dry riverbeds but grazed in green pastures. Women, the backbone of rural survival, became entrepreneurs and leaders. Irrigation cooperatives gave them not just income, but a louder voice in village decisions. Water was reshaping gender dynamics as much as agriculture. Politically, Traoré capitalized on the success. At rallies, he reminded the people, "The West said we would beg forever. But today, our children eat from our own soil." For critics, the project revealed something darker. Water was no longer just survival, it had become a political weapon. The stakes stretched far beyond today. If Burkina Faso could stabilize food production, it might finally escape the cycle of aid dependency that defined its modern history. Secure harvests could cool unrest, slow migration, and restore stability across entire regions. But the risks were just as real. Water scarcity has a way of reopening old wounds. Already, whispers of disputes over shared reservoirs spread between provinces. In times of drought, some feared water politics could prove as combustible as oil politics elsewhere, yet the vision pressed forward. Each dam filled, each basin replenished, each well restored was more than engineering, it was the reshaping of a nation's identity. Sovereignty was no longer a speech in Addis Ababa or a slogan at the African Union. It was a tomato sprouting in October, a goat drinking in March, a child back in school because water was close to home. Still, a question lingered: would ordinary people accept hidden reserves controlled by the state? Or would the valves of sovereignty become new tools of power? Tell us below. Meanwhile, the doctrine of buried water spilled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The United Nations called it ambitious but risky, an experiment in adaptation from a country long dismissed as fragile. The World Bank was harsher, warning of unsustainable debt and the massive costs of desalination pipelines and underground reservoirs. To them, the numbers didn't add up. But the subtext was clear: international lenders feared losing leverage. By turning to African Development Bank bonds, bilateral credits with India, and sovereign energy offsets, Traoré had cut around the old cycle of loans and conditions. To many Africans, what the World Bank saw as fiscal danger looked like financial independence. In Brussels and Geneva, the pushback was sharper still. Global water corporations, who for decades profited from privatized contracts, filtration patents, and even water futures markets, saw Burkina Faso's move as heresy. Declaring water a sovereign right and burying it to keep it safe threatened not just profits, but a model of global business. If one African state rejected the commodification of water, what stopped others from following? Not all responses were hostile. Instead of IMF loans or Western donor packages, Burkina Faso tapped African. To Western economists, this looked unorthodox. But to Africans weary of debt traps, it looked like freedom.